This is Agriculture Today, and I'm Shelby Varner with the K-State Radio Network. Roger McEowen, K-State and Washburn law professor, begins the show today with agricultural law and taxation issues involving sustainable aviation fuel, research and development credit, drones, and Fencerows. Keeping the show rolling is K-State weed specialist Sarah Lancaster discussing fall weed management. She says how growers need to continue to manage and control weeds around harvest. Brad White, Dustin Pendell, Brian Lubbers, and Phillip Lancaster from K-State's Beef Cattle Institute wrap up the show, where the group is conversing about implants and beef on dairy cattle. That and more is coming up ahead. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we start our Wednesday show talking with K-State and Washburn law professor Roger McEowen. Roger, thanks for joining us today.
Good to be with you, Shelby.
Roger, today covering a wide variety of topics and starting off by discussing sustainable aviation fuel and why agriculture is involved with this.
Well, Shelby, this actually dates back a couple of years. The USDA's Climate Smart Agriculture Program is what establishes practices for cultivating corn and soybeans for use as sustainable aviation feedstocks. And it's tied into the tax code. There's a clean fuel tax credit that's available for those that sell or use SAF, that's sustainable aviation fuel. And farmers are being incentivized to adopt sustainable farming practices to grow crops that are going to be used to produce the fuel. And it's a credit that applies for each gallon of SAF that is produced. And the whole idea of all of this is to reduce greenhouse gas emissions.
And how is this something maybe that's not super sustainable or efficient?
Well, that's a good question, because the whole idea behind this is supposedly to reduce carbon emissions. And the USDA got millions of dollars under the Green New Deal, which is also known as the Inflation Reduction Act, in 2022. And then the USDA established the idea of climate-smart agricultural farming practices. Well, at the same time, a tax credit was created for 23 and 24 for the production of so-called clean fuel. And the whole deal is hooked together by contracts between USDA and major national commodity groups, who in turn enter into agreements with third parties to certify that a farmer is also growing corn and soybeans in the government-approved manner. And so basically what a farmer has to do to potentially qualify for a tax benefit here is to use no-till and cover crops. A little bit more complicated than that, but I think people will get the idea. And then an ethanol plant receives the crops grown in that government-approved manner so that its carbon score can be reduced, and the SAF produced will qualify the plant for a credit, which then would be supposedly some would be passed through to farmers. Now, the problem with all of this, to get to your question, Shelby, is that there's no way in our current system to identity preserve corn and make sure that's the only corn that goes into the SAF. And another problem is that powering airplanes with crops is inefficient and unsustainable. And there are studies out there that indicate that it takes about 1.7 gallons of corn ethanol for every gallon of SAF produced. And so if we're going to reach the goal of, in the U.S. right now, of 35 billion gallons of ethanol-based SAF, that's going to require 114 million acres of corn. And another problem with this is that the government model that is used to measure the reduction in an ethanol plant's carbon score, because they have to get it down a certain level to even be eligible for the credit, and it's based on the way crops are produced. They didn't account for the fuel used in producing the crops. And so the whole process is flawed, and we're currently waiting for more guidance from the IRS with respect to the new credit that's going to take effect in 2025. So I think it's safe to say as of right now, as we speak, it's kind of a mess.
Roger, talking about some more credits you recently included in an article that involve research and development tax credits.
Yeah, a business can potentially be eligible for a tax credit for qualified expenses that are associated with research and development. It's known as the R&D credit. And over the years, Congress has expanded the availability of that credit so that a lot of farmers might qualify to take it. Now, I say a lot and I say might together. A lot might. A few may actually qualify. This provision is very detailed. There are some unscrupulous promoters out there that are pushing this to farmers, so you've got to be really careful about this. But basically, the credit can apply if your farming operation has qualifying research expenses. And if you do, and you have enough, then the credit could be about 10 to 15%, which could help you reduce your payroll tax or your overall tax burden. But there is a four-part test in the code that a farmer has to satisfy.
What is that four-part test?
Well, the research has to create a new or improved product or process to increase performance, function, reliability, or quality. That's one. The research has to also involve experimentation and minimize uncertainty about the development of product or process. So those are the next two. And then the last one is that the research has to rely on hard sciences such as engineering or chemistry or biology.
Is this something that would work on a producer's whole farm or just portions of it?
It won't work on a whole farm. Can it work for a farmer? Possibly, but you have to have, in essence, a research lab. So the IRS has already said, well, your whole farm is not a research lab. You can have a test plot, test your research and what you're doing with your research and test that on your farm, but only the expenses associated with your test plot would qualify. And that is a point some promoters don't make clear. And indeed, last year, I think it was May of 23, the IRS Criminal Investigation Division examined an R&D promoter that was aggressively targeting farmers, and that one's still kind of up in the air as to what the conclusion of the Criminal Investigation Division of IRS is going to do with that promoter. But one other point I would make on this is you should probably incur at least $100,000 of qualified R&D expenses to make this thing worthwhile for tax purposes. And that's just because of the way the formulas work and how you complete the forms. And I think you're going to have to get about six figures to make this worthwhile for just about any farmer to worry about.
And something else happening in agriculture right now, important to agriculture and the privacy of others, involving drones and a case involving a Texas drone law.
Yeah, we're about ready to start up the next term of the U.S. Supreme Court. And, of course, last term, as you and I have talked, there were a number of cases that were prominent in terms of agriculture. And we've got another one that the U.S. Supreme Court is going to consider on day one when they start their session next week, and that is whether they want to take up a case involving the Texas drone law. And it's not an ag-specific case, but, we use drones more and more often every year in agriculture for crop scouting and livestock checking and various types of things. And all states have drone laws that outline the permissible and impermissible use of drones. And the Texas law, like many other states, has surveillance provisions and no-fly provisions. And the law says that a drone cannot be used to capture an image of an individual or a privately owned property with the intent to conduct surveillance. And news gathering is not an exempted use, and the law's no-fly provision makes it unlawful to fly a drone over certain structures, including a confined animal feeding operation. Well, what we have in this case is a couple of media organizations that have challenged this on constitutional grounds, First Amendment free speech grounds. And the court, at their initial conference coming up right at the end of September, I think September 30th, they are set to decide whether they're going to hear this case. So this will be a big one. I think they might take this case. This has significant First Amendment concerns.
Depending on how this case plays out, will this still allow farmers to use drones?
Yes, in accordance with state law, and we'll see whether the Texas statute is deemed to be unconstitutional on free speech grounds because news organizations were not exempted from it, and of course that's where the First Amendment comes in. So we'll see. We'll see what happens. The court may not take the case, but they might. We'll see.
As we round out today's interview, wanting to mention a few things when it comes to cleaning out fence rows.
Yeah, this is a fairly common post-harvest and wintertime activity. We like to clean out fence rows then. And it's that clean-out process that can generate legal issues that people might not have thought about. So when you're cleaning out a fence row, what should you do, for example, if there's a tree in the fence line? Is that your neighbor's tree? Is that your tree? What can you do? Well, in that situation, each adjacent owner has an ownership interest in the tree. It's considered to be jointly owned, and you could be liable for damages if you cut it down and your neighbor objects. But if you only have branches or roots of the tree that are on your side of the property line, And those branches and roots don't give the neighbor an ownership interest in the tree, and so you can trim those up to the extent they hang over your property. And so that could be a big deal. For example, if you're dealing with a thorn tree that's got the large, 4 or 5 inch thorns on them that can puncture tires, you want to be able to control that.
What about if a tree falls onto your property?
Well, if that happens, it's your responsibility to clean up the mess, but you can keep the resulting firewood. And, of course, if a tree falls on your neighbor's side, they can do the same thing. And it's not a trespass to be on your neighbor's side of the fence also when you're doing fence maintenance, such as cleaning up a fence row. So you're not restricted just to standing on your property line when you're cleaning out a fence line that is owned in common with you and your neighbor. That's another issue that comes up. Sometimes people get picky about that, but no, that's not a trespass when you're doing fence maintenance and fence clean out.
In this scenario, good to just have a working relationship with the neighbor on the other side of the fence, hopefully?
That's always best, yes. We want to keep those lines of communication open and make sure your neighbor knows what you're doing. Some people get pretty touchy about that, and there are some weird cases that are out there, and I get some weird calls on this. But hopefully you maintain good neighbor relations while you get those fence rows cleaned out this winter.
Roger, I appreciate you taking the time to join us today and share with us some things that are happening with agricultural law and tax.
Thank you, Shelby.
That was K-State and Washburn law professor Roger McEowen. If you'd like to read more on these topics, I will link the blog article that covers them in today's show notes on agtoday.net, or you can also find them by navigating to agmanager.info. We're cutting to a short break now on Agriculture Today, but stick around because we have more for you up ahead. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we continue our show discussing weed management practices with K-State weed specialist Sarah Lancaster. Sarah, thanks for joining us today.
My pleasure, Shelby.
Sarah, as we're thinking about weed management right now in the fall, why is it important to be proactive in this time of year?
So one of the things that we know about weed management is that next year, well, quite frankly, the next probably 5 or more years' problems are all related to what kind of weed seed rain we get from any particular growing season. And so, we know that there are going to be weed escapes in a field. We know there's going to be some weeds that come up, and kind of hang out under the crop canopy. And then what oftentimes we see this time of year is that as the crop canopy dries down, or after for example, corn is harvested, those weeds are there and they take advantage of that newfound space. And they will go ahead and produce seeds and cause problems for the future. So, there's never a time when we shouldn't be thinking about how to manage that weed seed bank, and harvest is no exception.
And speaking of harvest, good just for whoever's sitting in the combine to note what's around the field?
Yeah, I know there's a lot of things that happen in a combine cab at any given moment, Shelby, but that's really a good opportunity to try to start taking some notes about where maybe weedier spots are in the field. And, it's probably something guys that have been farming fields for an extended period of time, they kind of have an instinct anyway of where the weedy patches are, just based on, past use of the field or the way the water drains across the field, things of that nature. But it's important, I think, to try to take advantage of moments during harvest when we have sort of that bird's eye view from the combine cab of where the weed populations are.
And is this something where producers need to go ahead and get out in their sprayer and get it taken care of?
That's something that we're actually going to run an e-update on here in the near future, is this idea not necessarily of chasing the combine with the sprayer, but what is the role of fall applied herbicide applications? As we think about, again, trying to manage weed seed production for future, to make weed management easier in future years, the idea of a potential fall applied herbicide application starts to become more and more attractive. No, it's not necessarily something that you're going to see an immediate, yield increase because of. And I understand that with today's commodity prices, the idea of spending money on weed control that's not going to result in an immediate, return That's a tough pill to swallow, I think, in these economic conditions. But as we think about the long-term effects and the long-term costs of, what that fall application might help us with, I think it's worth considering for sure. Especially, Shelby, most of the time when we're chatting, I'm thinking and talking about Palmer amaranth, but the weeds where these fall applications can really be helpful are those weeds that emerge earlier in the spring or even in the fall. So thinking about things like kochia or horseweed / mare's tail / whatever the name of the day is for that weed, our fall emerging winter annual grasses, things of that nature. So even though it's not a direct, dollar in equals bushels out kind of scenario, it's still beneficial to think about those fall herbicide applications.
And Sarah, there is some research from Georgia that shows just how much one plant can impact a crop field.
Oh man, yeah. So this is some interesting work that was done in Georgia, and they basically figured out that one female plant for every 5 acres resulted in an additional, and this is Palmer amaranth, so one female or seed-producing Palmer amaranth plant for every 5 acres adds something like 2 million seeds to that field that have to be controlled in the future. So in this situation, it took 6 years of total control of Palmer amaranth to reduce the seed bank by 98%. So, that one escape can have long-term implications for weed management in the future.
Are there additional concerns that as producers are in the fields with their combines and those weeds already being there, increasing additional spread?
Yeah, so, sometimes we don't necessarily think about harvest order when we're thinking about weed management, right? It's go time. We're going to go cut what's ready to cut or go harvest what's ready to harvest. And so one of the things to think about, though, as you're thinking about harvest order, is that we can move weed seeds from field to field with equipment, especially with harvest equipment. There are so many places where, especially again, thinking about those tiny little Palmer amaranth or water hemp seeds, those can hide in so many places on the combine. There are some fairly, labor and time intensive ways of cleaning combines, but there are also some faster ways. Leaf blowers can be handy for getting chaff and potential weed seeds out of nooks and crannies. There are some methods where you can think about just letting the combine kind of run empty a little bit, kind of open up some of those doors and traps, and to let then that combine kind of clean itself out too, if you don't want to get compressed air, get a leaf blower, something of that nature. Other things to think about if folks are doing fall tillage, right? That's another way that is commonly a method of weed seed spread. So just being aware and kind of thinking about, within the logistics that you are dealing with, what is the order of operations that makes the most sense to keep the weeds where they are, so they're not spread all across the countryside.
And while there might not be time for that deep clean in the middle of harvest, important to get one done, hopefully when harvest wraps up for that crop.
Oh, for sure. We definitely don't want to have, those weed seeds sitting in the combine from, let's say, soybean harvest, and then get that combine back out to say, harvest wheat in July, and those pigweed seeds are still sitting there. So for sure.
Sarah, as we are talking about weed management, wanting to mention a survey that you're working on with a grad student here at K-State that involves weed management used by Kansas soybean producers.
Yes, Shelby, we do a lot of work in soybean weed management, and a good chunk of that work is funded by soybean checkoff dollars. And actually, this survey is one of those studies. So my graduate student, Selena Rayla, she has been working to put together this survey to try to kind of get some better documentation of the different types of pre-emergence herbicides that our farmers are using, and just kind of gauge their level of satisfaction with those herbicides, as well as to get some good documentation for farmer practices like row spacing and planting date. So all of those things that kind of work together to give us a good weed management system in soybeans. So if folks are interested in helping us and willing to help us with this survey, Shelby, It can be found in the e-update from last week. There's a QR code that they can scan with their smartphone. There's a link they can click. We will also have this posted on X or Twitter as well.
Is that under the Department of Agronomy, Sarah?
Yeah, so it would come out when the Department of Agronomy posts the article from the e-update, and it will also come out. We will share that as well over time.
Will this hopefully only take producers a few minutes to complete it?
Yeah, so as we were testing it, our goal was to keep it around 5 minutes to take. So we think we have it pretty friendly to take on a smartphone or mobile device, and it shouldn't take much time. There's some answers that are easy to do and like check the box. There's some places where if folks are willing and interested, they can give us some more kind of free form or longer feedback.
Sarah, I appreciate you taking the time to join us today and share with us some information about fall weed management.
Thanks for having me, Shelby.
That was Kansas State University weed specialist Sarah Lancaster discussing weed management practices for this time of year. If you'd like to read more on this topic, you can do so by going to the September 19th Agronomy E-Update and finding the article titled Weed Management Practices, Fall Scouting, and Equipment Cleaning. Within that same September 19th Agronomy E-Update, at the bottom is an article titled Survey of Integrated Weed Management Practices Used by Kansas Soybean Producers. And this article is a survey that Sarah mentioned. You can complete this survey by either clicking on the link or using your phone to scan the QR code. I, of course, will link both of these in today's show notes on agtoday.net, or you can find it for yourself by going to eupdate.agronomy.ksu.edu. And while you're there, if you haven't, you can sign up for the weekly e-newsletters that are put out by K-State's Department of Agronomy. And while we are talking about chemical weed control, I would like to remind you of the K-State Research and Extension publication that Sarah helps put out, which is the 2024 Chemical Weed Control for Field Crops, Pastures, Rangeland, and Non-Cropland publication. You can find this publication by going to bookstore.ksre.ksu.edu, or of course I will link it in today's show notes on agtoday.net. We're cutting to a short break now on Agriculture Today, but when we come back, we'll be joined by K-State's Beef Cattle Institute's Brad White, Dustin Pendell, Brian Lubbers, and Phillip Lancaster as they discuss implants in beef on dairy cattle. We're now cutting to that short break. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and rounding out Wednesday's show is K-State's Beef Cattle Institute's Brad White, Dustin Pendell, Brian Lubbers, and Phillip Lancaster.
So I want to switch topics, guys, and talk about implants. And the question is on beef dairy cross calves, and specifically in this one, Angus Jersey cross calves. When should I implant them, or should I implant them? And actually, even though it's a question on implants, Dustin, I'm going to go to you first because I know you had some thoughts on this.
So, yeah, there wasn't a lot in this particular question, but I guess my first question to the listener would be, what's the marketing plan? What are you trying to do? I understand the goal is to make more money. I get that. But are you taking these calves to a sale barn? Are you going to sell these direct to a consumer? You got to have market access. Got to start building these relationships. So I guess I would want to know more about the marketing plan, or how are they marketing these calves?
Well, and how long to hold them on that are they staying on that operation for a while? Actually may affect my implant strategy because, Brian, there's some new label recommendations, or actually the label recommendations aren't new, but how we're following them are a little bit new. You may talk about that on implants.
Yeah, so it was essentially a clarification by the FDA where most of the implants were not labeled for a re-implant. And so if it's not labeled, then it's an extra label use. And for a long time, this is not new, we've not been allowed to use pharmaceutical products in an extra label manner for production purposes. So that's essentially how it came out, is this is a production purpose. That's not on the label. That's not legal. And so there are a few implants now that are labeled with a re-implant on the label. And I would say a lot of the ones that you would use in calves, so this question, are those ones. So I think, again, it kind of fits with what Dustin said about, if you understand what your marketing strategy is, and maybe if your marketing strategy is a direct to consumer and they're wanting more of a natural product, even though you're probably not labeling it that way, you may not implant, right? And I think thinking about cost, so their question is about how do I make more money? But if to make more money, you have to put a lot more cost into them, you're not actually making more, you're just getting a bigger check at the end.
So now we've provided some context for this, and Philip, I'll turn to you and ask, what would you do in this scenario given what these guys have said?
So I don't have a whole lot of information on implanting bottle calves. There's not a lot of data out there. So I'm going to kind of take some stuff we typically do in the beef industry. And so lots of operations will implant those calves around 3 months of age when they're doing their first round of vaccinations and other things like that. So in this situation, when you pull those calves out of the hutch and move them to group pens, maybe a good time to go ahead and give them that first implant. And you're getting them on a solid diet. You're transitioning them to really start pushing them to grow. And so that's probably a good time to do it.
So implants, and strategy-wise, I think one thing to think about, where you put it in is important, because the implant is only helpful if they have the nutrition and resources to take advantage of it. So if I'm feeding a calf early in his life and basically he's using up all the nutrition I'm already giving him and he can't take in more nutrition, the implant doesn't help him be more efficient. When he gets a little bit later, he's eating more, he's going forward. So, and I'm thinking about like very young versus as you get to where you talked about, maybe at that weaning stage and he's really ready to grow and I can provide him more resources to take advantage of it. Am I agreeing with what you're saying?
Yeah, I don't know that implanting a calf that's still on the bottle would be very beneficial, because you're kind of limiting his intake with a couple, bottles a day. But after they've weaned, they've gotten up and they're ramping up their intake on that starter diet, and then you're moving them out of the hutch, off of the starter and onto the grower diet. I think you're handling them anyway. I think that's a good time to do it, and I think that fits pretty well with the nutritional plan.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree. And I think there's some options there, but I'll go back to what Brian and Dustin said. So talking about the marketing plan for those calves and be sure that we're on label. So I think you've got lots of options there, but you want to think through the whole lifetime plan, not just what are we looking at during this calf food phase, because I'm for sure going to want to implant him as he gets later in life in most situations, but my marketing plan may dictate how I want to handle those. So great question there. We appreciate you sending those in. If you have questions for us, you can always send them to us at bci@ksu.edu.
That was part of the Beef Cattle Institute's Cattle Chat podcast. That's all we have for you today on Agriculture Today, but we'll be back with more for you tomorrow.